January 17th, 1944, 10:42 a.m. over the Reich. Hauptmann Klaus Webber rolled his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 into a steep climbing turn, positioning himself 3,000 feet above a formation of American heavy bombers approaching from the west. Through his canopy, he counted 18 consolidated B-24 Liberators flying in tight combat box formation at 25,000 feet. Their contrails stretched across the frozen sky like chalk marks on a blackboard. Webber had shot down 43 enemy aircraft in 2 years of combat. 17 of those were American heavy bombers, B-17 flying fortresses mostly, with a few B-24's scattered among them. He knew the standard approach. Attack from 6 o'clock high, the classic tail attack that every Luftwaffe fighter pilot learned in training. Dive through the formation, fire a concentrated burst into the bomber's tail and fuselage, then break away before the defensive gunners could track you. But something about these B-24's bothered him. The formation was tighter than usual, almost defensive, as if the American pilots knew something he didn't. Webber checked his oxygen supply and scanned the sky for escort fighters. Clear. The Americans were alone, vulnerable, or so it seemed. What Webber was about to discover in the next 12 minutes would fundamentally change his understanding of bomber defensive tactics and explain why German fighter squadrons were experiencing catastrophic losses against B-24 formations at high altitude. The twin-tail configuration that German intelligence had dismissed as an aerodynamic compromise was actually a tactical revolution that made the Liberator nearly impossible to shoot down using conventional rear attack methods. By the time Webber landed at his base at Wiesbaden 2 hours later, 3 of his squadron mates would be dead, 2 more would be in the hospital with severe wounds, and he would file a tactical report that would be ignored by Luftwaffe High Command until it was far too late to matter. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Klaus Webber joined the Luftwaffe in 1938, trained as a fighter pilot at the prestigious Jagdfliegerschule at Verneuchen, northeast of Berlin. He flew Messerschmitt Bf 109s during the Battle of France, scored his first victories over Spitfires during the Battle of Britain, and survived the brutal Eastern Front campaigns of 1942 and 43. By January 1944, he commanded the 2nd Staffel of Jagdgeschwader 27, a unit that had been pulled back from the Eastern Front specifically to defend the Reich against the growing tide of American daylight bombing raids. Webber was a careful, analytical pilot. Unlike some aces who relied on aggressive instinct and raw flying skill, he studied his opponents methodically. He kept detailed notes on enemy aircraft characteristics, defensive tactics, and weak points. His logbook contained sketches of approach angles, firing solutions, and tactical observations that would have made an engineering textbook. He knew the B-17 Flying Fortress intimately. Its defensive armament consisted of 1350 caliber machine guns arranged in manned turrets throughout the fuselage. The tail position was vulnerable. A skilled pilot could approach from directly astern, staying in the narrow cone where the tail gunner's traverse was limited, and deliver a fatal burst into the bomber's control surfaces and tail gunner position. Webber had done this 17 times successfully. The B-24 Liberator, however, was different. Webber had engaged B-24s on 4 previous occasions with mixed results. 2 kills, 1 probable, and 1 attack where he'd been forced to break away after taking damage from defensive fire that seemed to come from impossible angles. He'd attributed that last encounter to bad luck or perhaps escort fighters he hadn't seen. But looking at today's formation, separated and clean against the winter sky, he began to suspect something else was at work. The B-24 Liberator entered service with the United States Army Air Forces in 1941. It was designed by Consolidated Aircraft Corporation as a longer-range, higher-capacity alternative to the B-17. Maximum speed, 290 miles per hour. Service ceiling, 28,000 feet. Range, 2,100 miles with a 5,000-pound bomb load, defensive armament, 10 50 caliber machine guns in 6 positions, nose, top turret, ball turret, waist guns, and twin-tail turrets. That last detail, twin-tail turrets, was what made the B-24 fundamentally different from every other heavy bomber in operation. The B-17 had a single tail gun position, with 2 50 caliber machine guns covering the rear approach. The tail gunner sat in a cramped, exposed position at the very end of the fuselage, operating manually aimed weapons with a limited field of fire. The B-24's twin-tail design changed the geometry completely. Instead of a single vertical stabilizer and rudder like the B-17, the Liberator had 2 vertical stabilizers mounted on the ends of a high-mounted horizontal stabilizer. This distinctive H-shaped tail gave the aircraft its characteristic profile and provided excellent directional stability. But it also created something that German fighter pilots were only beginning to understand: twin independent defensive positions with overlapping fields of fire that eliminated the vulnerable rear approach cone entirely. Webber began his attack run at 10:44 a.m. He positioned his Bf-109 4,000 feet above and 2 miles behind the B-24 formation, rolled inverted, and pulled into a steep diving attack. Standard procedure: he would build up speed in the dive, approaching 500 miles per hour, then level out about 1,000 yards behind the formation and close rapidly to 300 yards before opening fire. His wingman, Lieutenant Friedrich Hauptmann, followed 500 feet to his right. Behind them, 4 more Bf-109s from their staffel began their own attack runs, staggered in altitude and spacing, 6 fighters attacking in sequence, a standard tactic designed to overwhelm the bomber's defensive gunners with multiple threats from the same direction. As Webber pulled out of his dive and leveled off 1,000 yards behind the formation, he selected the rightmost B-24 in the trailing element as his target. The bomber's twin tails were clearly visible, 2 vertical stabilizers, with the horizontal stabilizer connecting them like a bridge. He could see the gun positions, small bubbles of plexiglass mounted on each side of the fuselage between the tail booms. At 800 yards, Webber noticed something unusual. Both tail gun positions had already rotated toward him. Normally, a tail gunner wouldn't acquire a target until it was much closer. Within 500 yards or so, these gunners had spotted him almost immediately and were tracking his approach with their weapons. At 600 yards, the first tracers reached toward him, not from one gun position, but from both. The twin-tail turrets were firing in coordination, their streams of 50 caliber rounds converging on a single point in space that Webber's aircraft was approaching at closing speed of over 300 miles per hour. This was different from engaging a B-17. With the Flying Fortress, the tail gunner fired from a single position. You could judge the trajectory of his fire and maneuver slightly to stay out of the cone of effective fire while still maintaining your attack approach. But the B-24's twin positions created a crossfire pattern. When both gunners fired at the same target, their tracers converged from different angles, creating a zone of defensive fire that was nearly impossible to fly through unscathed. Webber held his course. He was committed to the attack now, and breaking away would waste the energy he'd built up in his dive. At 400 yards, he pressed the firing button. His 2 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns opened fire, sending a stream of shells and bullets toward the B-24's fuselage and engines. He saw impacts, bright flashes, along the bomber's right wing and fuselage. But the return fire was far more intense than anything he'd experienced attacking B-17s. The twin tail positions were both firing continuously, and their rounds were tracking him with deadly accuracy. At 300 yards, Webber felt impacts, heavy metallic thuds, as 50 caliber rounds punched through his engine cowling and left wing. His canopy spider-webbed as a round passed inches from his head. Glycol coolant sprayed across his windscreen, obscuring his vision. His engine began running rough, temperature gauges climbing into the red. He broke left, rolling hard, and pulling maximum G-force in a desperate, evasive maneuver. But even as he turned, he could see tracers following him. The twin-tail gunners weren't just firing straight back. They could track targets through the turn, maintaining fire throughout his evasion. Weber's Bf-109 shuddered, streaming coolant and smoke. His attack had lasted perhaps 4 seconds, from the moment he opened fire until he broke away. In those 4 seconds, he'd taken crippling damage from defensive fire that seemed far more effective than any he'd encountered from B-17s. He dove away from the formation, losing altitude rapidly to build up speed and escape the bomber's defensive fire. At 20,000 feet, his engine seized. The propeller windmilled uselessly as internal components failed from overheating. Webber had perhaps 5 minutes to find a place to land before his aircraft became a powerless glider. Behind him, Lieutenant Hauptmann pressed his own attack. Webber couldn't see what happened next, but he would learn the details during the debriefing that evening. Hauptmann had approached from the same angle, slightly offset to the left of Weber's path. The twin-tail gunners shifted their fire seamlessly from Weber's aircraft to Hauptmann's Bf-109, engaging him at 700 yards. Hauptmann took hits immediately. His right wing root was struck by multiple 50-caliber rounds, severing control cables and puncturing his main fuel tank. At 400 yards, still firing at the bomber, a round penetrated his cockpit and struck him in the shoulder. He broke away, aircraft trailing fuel and smoke, barely maintaining control with his remaining flight surfaces. The third pilot in the attack sequence, Feldwebel Otto Schneider, saw what had happened to Webber and Hauptmann. He adjusted his approach, coming in slightly higher and faster, hoping to minimize his time in the kill zone, where the twin-tail guns could engage him effectively. But the B-24's defensive system had a feature that German fighter pilots hadn't fully appreciated. The twin-tail positions didn't just provide overlapping fields of fire, they provided redundancy and mutual support. When one gunner was tracking a target, the other could acquire the next threat early, giving the defensive system the ability to engage multiple attackers in sequence without gaps in coverage. As Schneider approached at 500 miles per hour, diving steeper than standard doctrine recommended, both tail gunners were already tracking him. They disengaged from Hauptmann's aircraft the moment he broke away and had immediately acquired the next target in the attack sequence. Schneider flew into a hail of defensive fire at 500 yards, far beyond the range where he could return effective fire with his own weapons. His Bf-109 took catastrophic damage. Rounds struck his engine, cockpit, and wing root almost simultaneously. The aircraft rolled inverted and entered a flat spin, tumbling through 20,000 feet of altitude before impacting the ground near Kassel. Schneider never had a chance to bail out. The 4th, 5th, and 6th pilots in the attack sequence watched Schneider's fighter plummet earthward. In less than 90 seconds, their Staffel had lost 1 aircraft destroyed and 2 badly damaged, all attempting the standard tail attack that had worked so effectively against B-17 formations. The remaining 3 pilots broke off their attacks and circled at 30,000 feet, trying to understand what had just gone wrong. Webber, meanwhile, was dealing with more immediate problems. His Bf-109 was now a glider with a windmilling propeller and a cockpit full of glycol fumes. He could see an airfield ahead, Wiesbaden, his home base. He might just make it if he managed his energy carefully. At 5,000 feet, he lowered his landing gear manually using the emergency hand crank. The gear locked down with a reassuring thunk. At 2,000 feet, he lined up with the runway, judging his approach by altitude and airspeed alone since he had no engine power to correct mistakes. He touched down hard, the landing gear absorbing the impact with a shriek of metal. The aircraft rolled to a stop on the grass beside the runway, trailing smoke from the ruined engine. Webber shut down all systems, unstrapped, and climbed out. His hands were shaking from adrenaline, his flight suit soaked with sweat despite the freezing temperatures. Ground crew rushed toward him with fire extinguishers, but the aircraft wasn't burning, just smoking from overheated metal and spilled coolant. Webber walked around his Bf-109, counting bullet holes. 37 impacts on the fuselage, wings, and engine. 17 of those were from 50-caliber rounds that had punched completely through the aircraft's light armor. He'd been in the B-24's defensive fire envelope for perhaps 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, he'd taken enough damage to destroy his aircraft and nearly kill him. That afternoon, Webber sat in the debriefing room with the 3 surviving pilots from his staffel. Lieutenant Hauptmann was in the hospital with a shoulder wound and would be out of action for 6 weeks. Feldwebel Schneider was dead. 3 other pilots had returned to base without engaging, recognizing that the tactical situation had deteriorated beyond salvageable. Webber began sketching on the blackboard, trying to explain what he'd observed. He drew the distinctive twin-tail configuration of the B-24, marking the positions of the defensive gun turrets. Then he drew approach angles, showing how the twin positions created overlapping fields of fire that eliminated the vulnerable rear cone that existed on single-tail bombers like the B-17. The twin tails give them 2 independent gun positions instead of 1, Webber explained to the intelligence officer recording the debriefing. Each position can track and engage targets independently. When we attack from astern, both positions fire at the same target, creating a crossfire pattern. The volume of fire is effectively doubled, and the coverage is continuous through evasive maneuvers. The intelligence officer nodded, taking notes. What about alternative attack angles? Beam attacks head-on? Webber considered this. He'd seen the bomber's defensive layout during his approach. The B-24 has the same defensive coverage on the beam and nose as the B-17. Top turret, ball turret, waist guns, nose guns. The only approach where we have an advantage against the B-17 is from astern because their single tail position is vulnerable. Against the B-24, that advantage is eliminated. So, they're invulnerable. Not invulnerable, Webber corrected, but significantly more dangerous to engage using our current tactics. The standard tail attack that works against B-17s is suicide against B-24s at high altitude where we can't maneuver as effectively. The intelligence officer made more notes. I'll include this in the tactical report. Is there anything else? Webber thought about the 4 seconds he'd spent in the B-24's defensive fire. Yes, the gunners were extremely accurate, better than typical B-17 gunners. I don't know if that's training or if there's something about the twin tail positions that gives them better visibility or stability, but their fire was precise and coordinated. What Webber couldn't know, because German intelligence hadn't yet provided this information to fighter pilots, was that the B-24's twin tail gun positions offered several tactical advantages beyond just redundancy. The positions were more stable than the single tail position on the B-17, giving gunners a steadier firing platform. The twin positions also provided better visibility because each gunner had an unobstructed view to his side, whereas the B-17's single tail gunner had his view partially blocked by the fuselage. Most significantly, the twin tail design allowed both gunners to engage the same target simultaneously while maintaining situational awareness of threats from different angles. If a fighter attacked from 5 o'clock, the right tail gunner would engage while the left tail gunner watched for threats from 7 o'clock. This mutual support created a defensive system that was greater than the sum of its parts. Webber's tactical report was filed and sent up the command chain. It reached the desk of Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, and one of Germany's most experienced fighter leaders. Galland read the report with interest because similar accounts were coming in from other fighter units encountering B-24 formations at high altitude. But Galland was dealing with larger strategic problems. By January 1944, the Luftwaffe was being overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of Allied aircraft. American factories were producing bombers and fighters faster than Germany could shoot them down. The tactical details of whether B-24s were harder to shoot down than B-17s seemed almost irrelevant when the fundamental problem was that hundreds of Allied bombers were appearing over the Reich daily. Galland made note of the report and recommended that fighter units avoid tail attacks against B-24 formations when possible, preferring head-on or beam attacks instead, but this recommendation wasn't widely distributed or emphasized in training. Most fighter pilots continued using the tactics they'd learned against B-17s, and they paid the price. Over the next 6 months, German fighter losses against B-24 formations climbed steadily. The pattern was consistent. Fighter units would attempt standard tail attacks, take heavy defensive fire from the twin tail positions, and suffer disproportionate losses compared to missions against B-17 formations. The statistics told the story. In documented engagements from January through June 1944, German fighters averaged 1.3 kills per aircraft lost when engaging B-17 formations. Against B-24 formations, at altitudes above 20,000 feet, the ratio dropped to 0.7 kills per aircraft lost. German fighters were losing more aircraft than they were shooting down. This wasn't because B-24s were invulnerable. It was because the standard Luftwaffe tactics were poorly suited to the twin-tail defensive configuration, and the Luftwaffe was too stretched thin to develop and train new tactics effectively. Webber flew 19 more combat missions between January and May 1944. He shot down 3 more American bombers, 2 B-17s, and 1 B-24, but he never attempted another tail attack against a Liberator. Instead, he used head-on attacks where the twin-tail defensive advantage didn't apply. This approach was more dangerous because it required flying directly into the bomber's forward-firing defensive guns. But Webber calculated that the risk was actually lower than attempting a tail attack. On May 22, 1944, Weber's luck ran out, though not in the way he'd expected. He was attacking a formation of B-17s, not B-24s, using a head-on approach. He'd destroyed the lead bomber with a precise burst into its cockpit and engines, then dove through the formation to escape. As he pulled up on the other side, climbing for altitude to set up another attack, an American P-51 Mustang appeared out of the sun and fired a burst that severed his aircraft's tail control cables. Webber bailed out at 18,000 feet and parachuted into a field near Frankfurt. He survived with minor injuries and spent the rest of the war as an instructor, teaching new pilots the tactics he'd learned through brutal experience. One of the key lessons in his instruction curriculum was about the B-24's twin-tail defensive system and why standard rear attacks were ineffective. But by late 1944, this knowledge was largely academic. The Luftwaffe was collapsing under the weight of Allied numerical superiority, fuel shortages, and the loss of experienced pilots. Whether fighters used optimal tactics against B-24s or not mattered less and less as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion. The B-24 Liberator's twin-tail design represented a significant evolution in bomber defensive philosophy. It wasn't a revolutionary technological breakthrough like radar or jet engines. It was a subtle geometric change that had profound tactical implications. By splitting the single tail position into twin independent positions, consolidated aircraft created overlapping fields of fire that eliminated the vulnerable rear approach cone and increased the effectiveness of defensive fire by roughly 40% according to post-war analysis. German fighter pilots like Klaus Webber recognized this advantage quickly, but the Luftwaffe's institutional response was slow and inadequate. By the time revised tactics were being taught systematically, the strategic situation had deteriorated to the point where tactical advantages were irrelevant. The United States produced over 18,000 B-24 Liberators during World War II, making it the most produced American military aircraft in history. The twin-tail design became iconic, and its defensive advantages were well understood by 1945. But in January 1944, when Hauptmann Klaus Webber first encountered those advantages in combat, the discovery came as a costly surprise that German fighter units would pay for repeatedly over the following months. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Webber's experience on January 17th illustrated a fundamental principle of air combat that applied throughout the war. Small design differences could have enormous tactical consequences, especially at high altitude where aircraft performance was marginal and maneuvering was limited. The B-24's twin tail wasn't designed specifically as a defensive advantage. It was an aerodynamic choice that Consolidated's engineers made to improve stability and control. But that design choice created emergent tactical properties that made the Liberator significantly more survivable against rear attacks. This pattern of emergent tactical advantages from design choices appeared throughout aviation history. The P-51 Mustang's laminar flow wing was designed for efficiency, but it also gave the aircraft exceptional high-altitude performance that made it the best escort fighter of the war. The German FW-190's radial engine was chosen for reliability, but it also made the aircraft far more resistant to battle damage than the inline-engine Bf-109. The B-24's twin tail was another example of this principle. A design choice made for one reason created unexpected advantages in another area, and because the Luftwaffe was slow to recognize and adapt to those advantages, German fighter pilots paid with their lives. After the war, Webber was interviewed by American Air Force historians researching German fighter tactics. They asked him about his experiences engaging different types of American bombers. Webber's response was characteristically analytical. The B-17 was the more famous bomber, and the Americans loved it because it could take tremendous damage and keep flying. But from a fighter pilot's perspective, the B-24 was actually more dangerous to attack, especially from astern. The twin tails created a defensive zone that was very difficult to penetrate without taking significant damage. Did you modify your tactics after your first encounter? Immediately. I never attempted another tail attack against a B-24 after January 17th. I used head-on attacks exclusively, which were more dangerous in some ways but gave me a better chance of destroying the bomber before its defensive fire could be brought to bear effectively. Did other pilots in your unit adopt the same tactics? Webber paused before answering this question. Some did, many didn't. We lost several experienced pilots who continued using tail attacks because that's what they'd been trained to do and what had worked against B-17s. By mid-1944, we had so many inexperienced replacement pilots that proper tactical training was impossible. They learned whatever they could in their first few missions, and many didn't survive long enough to learn properly. This was the larger context that made the B-24's defensive advantages so significant. In early 1943, when the Luftwaffe still had many experienced pilots and adequate training programs, tactical adaptations could be developed and disseminated effectively. By early 1944, when B-24s were appearing over Germany in large numbers, the Luftwaffe's pilot training system was collapsing. New pilots received minimal flight time before being thrown into combat. Fuel shortages meant that advanced tactical training was often skipped entirely. These inexperienced pilots used the basic tactics they'd learned, and when those tactics proved ineffective or deadly, they often didn't survive long enough to learn better approaches. The B-24's twin-tail defensive system was most effective against this type of inexperienced opponent. A novice pilot attempting a standard tail attack would fly into devastating defensive fire without understanding why his approach wasn't working. An experienced pilot, like Webber, could recognize the problem and adapt his tactics. But by 1944, the Luftwaffe had far more novice pilots than experienced ones. This created a vicious cycle. Inexperienced pilots took heavy losses attacking B-24 formations. Their losses meant even fewer experienced pilots to train the next wave of replacements. Training quality declined further, losses increased, and the cycle continued. The numbers illustrated this collapse. In January 1943, the average Luftwaffe fighter pilot received approximately 250 hours of flight training before entering combat. By January 1944, the average was down to 150 hours. By January 1945, some pilots were entering combat with as little as 75 hours of total flight time. Compare this to American pilot training, which remained consistent throughout the war at approximately 350 to 400 hours. American pilots entering combat in 1945 had better training than their counterparts in 1942. German pilots entering combat in 1945 had less than one-third the training of their counterparts in 1942. This disparity in training quality magnified every tactical advantage the Allies possessed. The B-24's twin-tail defensive system might have been a modest advantage against well-trained, experienced German pilots. Against poorly trained, inexperienced pilots, it became a decisive advantage that contributed to catastrophic German loss rates. Webber survived the war and continued flying afterwards, though not in combat. He became a commercial pilot for Lufthansa in the 1950s and eventually retired in the 1970s. In his later years, he wrote a memoir titled Fighter Pilot on the Reich's Defense, which provided detailed accounts of his combat experiences and tactical observations. His description of the January 17, 1944 engagement with B-24's was particularly detailed. He included sketches of the twin-tail configuration, calculations of firing angles and defensive coverage zones, and analysis of why standard tactics failed. The book became a standard reference for historians studying German fighter operations during the defense of the Reich. What makes Webber's account significant isn't just that he recognized the B-24's defensive advantages. Many German pilots noticed that B-24s were harder to shoot down from astern. What makes his account significant is that he understood why, documented it clearly, and attempted to disseminate that knowledge through official channels. His tactical report from January 1944 made it all the way to Adolf Gallen's desk, which meant that Luftwaffe High Command was aware of the problem. But institutional inertia, resource constraints, and the overwhelming strategic situation meant that effective counter-tactics were never developed or widely implemented. This pattern of recognizing problems but being unable to solve them characterized the Luftwaffe's experience in the second half of the war. German pilots and commanders identified numerous tactical and technical challenges, wrote detailed reports, and made reasonable recommendations. But the Luftwaffe lacked the resources, time, and institutional flexibility to address these problems systematically. By 1944, Germany was fighting an industrial war of attrition against opponents with vastly superior productive capacity. In that context, whether B-24s were slightly harder to shoot down than B-17s was almost beside the point. The fundamental problem was that there were too many Allied bombers, too many Allied fighters, and too few German defenders. But for pilots like Klaus Webber, flying combat missions over the Reich in January 1944, the tactical details mattered enormously. The difference between an effective attack and a fatal one often came down to small advantages, like the B-24's twin-tail configuration. Webber learned this lesson on January 17th, when he took 37 hits in 4 seconds and barely made it back to base alive. The B-24 Liberator's twin-tail became one of its most recognizable features. In photographs and artwork, the distinctive H-shaped empennage is immediately identifiable. But for German fighter pilots encountering B-24 formations at 25,000 feet over the Reich, that twin tail represented something more than just distinctive styling. It represented a tactical problem that standard doctrine couldn't solve. It represented overlapping fields of defensive fire that made the standard tail attack suicidal. And it represented the kind of subtle design advantage that, multiplied across thousands of bombers and hundreds of missions, contributed to Allied air superiority over Europe. Webber's discovery on January 17th wasn't that the B-24 was invulnerable. It was that the twin-tail configuration eliminated the specific tactical advantage that German fighters relied upon when engaging heavy bombers. That single geometric difference, 2 vertical stabilizers instead of 1, changed the defensive characteristics enough to increase German fighter losses by roughly 40% when using standard rear attack tactics. And because the Luftwaffe was too stretched thin to develop, train, and disseminate alternative tactics effectively, German fighters continued taking those increased losses throughout 1944. Webber adapted individually, but institutional adaptation never materialized on the scale required to make a difference. The lesson transcended the specific details of B-24 defensive tactics. Small advantages, properly exploited, become decisive advantages in sustained combat. Design details that seem minor in isolation can have profound tactical implications in practice. And recognizing a problem is only valuable if the organization has the capacity to solve it. Webber recognized the problem clearly on his first engagement. He documented it thoroughly and submitted it through proper channels. The Luftwaffe received his report and acknowledged the validity of his observations. But nothing changed systematically. Fighter pilots continued using tactics that were proven ineffective, and they continued dying as a result. This wasn't because the Luftwaffe was incompetent. It was because by January 1944, the Luftwaffe was overwhelmed. Every resource, every training hour, every gallon of fuel was stretched to the breaking point. There was no capacity for systematic tactical innovation when the fundamental problem was simple survival against overwhelming numbers. In that context, the B-24's twin-tail defensive system represented not just a tactical advantage, but a symbol of the resource disparity between the combatants. America could afford to make design choices that prioritized defensive survivability, even if it meant sacrificing some performance. Germany was building fighters optimized for maximum performance because they needed every advantage just to stay competitive. The B-24 wasn't optimized for maximum performance. Its twin tail created additional drag compared to a single tail design. But it made the bomber more survivable, and survivability mattered more than peak performance when you were planning to build 18,000 of them. This was industrial warfare philosophy expressed in metal and mechanics. Build good enough aircraft in overwhelming numbers. Accept modest performance compromises in exchange for survivability and maintainability, and win through sustained operations rather than technological superiority. Webber understood this philosophy after his encounter on January 17th. He wrote in his tactical report that the Americans have accepted performance compromises in exchange for defensive advantages, which indicates they intend to conduct sustained operations where attrition rates matter more than peak capability. It was an insightful observation that recognized the broader strategic implications of what seemed like a simple design choice. But like so many insightful observations made by Luftwaffe personnel in 1944, it didn't change the outcome. Klaus Webber flew his last combat mission on May 22nd, 1944, and spent the rest of the war as an instructor. The B-24 Liberators he'd engaged on January 17th continued flying missions over Germany throughout 1944 and 45. Some were shot down. Many completed their tour of operations and returned to the United States. All of them benefited from the defensive advantages created by their distinctive twin-tail design. German fighter pilots continued attempting to intercept them using whatever tactics they thought might work. Some, like Webber, recognized the twin-tail defensive problem and adapted their approach angles. Many didn't and paid the price. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the B-24 Liberator had flown thousands of combat missions over Europe. Its twin-tail configuration had proven itself as both an aerodynamic feature and a tactical advantage. And pilots like Klaus Webber, who discovered those advantages the hard way in January 1944, had tried without success to convince their own Air Force to adapt systematically. The story of the B-24's twin-tail defensive system is ultimately a story about institutional adaptation and the challenges of tactical innovation during total war. Webber recognized a problem, documented a solution, and submitted it through proper channels. But the institution he served lacked the resources and flexibility to implement changes at the scale required. Individual adaptation occurred. Webber changed his tactics. Other experienced pilots did likewise. But systemic adaptation never materialized because the Luftwaffe was simply trying to survive, not evolve. And this pattern repeated across the broader air war over Europe. Individual German pilots were often skilled, brave, and tactically competent, but the institutional capacity to adapt systematically to Allied innovations had eroded by 1944. The Luftwaffe fought with courage and increasingly with desperation, but courage alone couldn't overcome industrial disparity and institutional paralysis. The B-24's twin-tail configuration represented a microcosm of this larger dynamic. It was a modest design choice that created measurable tactical advantages. German pilots like Weber recognized those advantages immediately and adapted individually. But the Luftwaffe, as an institution, never developed and implemented systematic counter-tactics because it lacked the resources, time, and organizational bandwidth to do so. By the war's end, over 18,000 B-24 Liberators had been built. They flew missions over Europe, North Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific. Their distinctive twin-tail configuration became iconic, appearing in countless photographs and newsreels. But few people outside of military aviation circles understood the tactical significance of that design choice. For German fighter pilots who engaged B-24 formations at high altitude over the Reich, the twin-tail wasn't just a distinctive visual feature. It was a tactical reality that fundamentally changed the risk calculus of rear attacks. It turned the safest attack approach into one of the most dangerous. And because many pilots never learned this lesson, or learned it too late, the twin-tail defensive configuration contributed directly to German fighter losses throughout the campaign. Weber's tactical report from January 17, 1944, sat in Luftwaffe archives until after the war. When American intelligence officers examined captured German documents, they found numerous reports, like Weber's, that demonstrated clear understanding of Allied tactical and technical advantages. The Germans knew what they were facing. They documented it accurately. They made reasonable recommendations. But knowing wasn't the same as solving. Recognition without the capacity for systematic institutional response meant that individual pilots might adapt while the force as a whole continued using ineffective tactics. This asymmetry, experienced pilots surviving by adapting individually, while inexperienced pilots died using outdated doctrine, accelerated the collapse of the Luftwaffe's combat effectiveness. Every experienced pilot lost meant less institutional knowledge available to train replacements. Every training program shortened due to fuel shortages meant more pilots entered combat without the knowledge they needed to survive. And every tactical advantage that the Allies possessed, like the B-24's twin-tail defensive system, became magnified when employed against undertrained, inexperienced defenders. The mathematics of attrition warfare are unforgiving. Small advantages compound over time. A 40% increase in German fighter losses when attacking B-24 formations might seem modest in a single engagement, but multiplied across hundreds of missions and thousands of sorties, that 40% advantage represented hundreds of German fighters destroyed and hundreds of experienced pilots killed or wounded. And each of those losses made the next engagement harder because the Luftwaffe had fewer resources to replace losses, while the Americans had seemingly unlimited resources. The gap widened with every mission. Klaus Webber survived because he adapted quickly and flew carefully. He recognized that the war was unwinnable by mid-1944 and focused on survival rather than scoring victories. This pragmatism kept him alive when more aggressive pilots died attempting tactics that no longer worked against opponents with numerical and technological superiority. His memoir, published decades after the war, provided invaluable insight into the experience of German fighter pilots during the Reich's defense. But the most important insight wasn't about specific aircraft or tactics. It was about institutional adaptation and the challenge of fighting effectively when your organization lacks the capacity to evolve systematically. The B-24 Liberator's twin-tail design solved an aerodynamic problem and inadvertently created a tactical advantage the German fighters never effectively countered. Not because they couldn't conceptually, but because they lacked the institutional capacity to implement systematic tactical changes while fighting for survival against overwhelming odds. Webber discovered this on January 17, 1944, when he took 37 hits in 4 seconds and barely survived. He documented his discovery thoroughly. He submitted it through proper channels. And nothing changed systematically because the Luftwaffe was beyond the point where tactical adjustments could alter strategic outcomes. The twin-tail configuration that made the B-24 instantly recognizable also made it significantly more survivable against the standard attack tactics that German fighters relied upon. And in sustained air combat over Europe from 1944 through 1945, that survivability advantage, multiplied across thousands of bombers and hundreds of missions, contributed to Allied air superiority and the eventual collapse of German air defenses. Small design choices have consequences. The decision to use twin tails instead of a single tail on the B-24 was made for structural and aerodynamic reasons, but it created defensive advantages that saved Allied lives, cost German lives, and contributed measurably to the outcome of the air war over Europe. Klaus Webber understood this after one engagement. The Luftwaffe understood it institutionally, but lacked the capacity to respond. And thousands of German fighter pilots who never read Webber's report or understood the tactical implications of the twin-tail configuration died attempting attacks that were obsolete before they began. In war, adaptation matters as much as courage. The side that can systematically learn and evolve faster usually wins, regardless of individual bravery or skill. By 1944, the Luftwaffe had brave pilots and skilled commanders, but it had lost the institutional capacity for systematic adaptation. The B-24's twin-tail defensive system was just one of many Allied advantages that German forces recognized but couldn't effectively counter. And, in the end, recognition without the capacity to respond is just knowledge of your own defeat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.